Hi, everybody. This is Bev Live. I am your host, live from the Bev Live studios. Good evening, everybody. I hope you had a wonderful week and it's Friday evening. It's time to talk about wine. Last week, we talked about Riesling. We're starting a new series where we talk about the different grape varieties so that when you are shopping for wine, you have a deep understanding of what's out there, and therefore, you may not be disappointed what you put in your glass at home. So last week we talked about Riesling, and this week we're going to shift gear a little bit. We are going to talk about Cabernet Sauvignon. It is the most planted varietal on planet Earth. There is not another varietal that's planted more. We all have heard of Cabernet Sauvignon. Most of us have had Cabernet Sauvignon, and it is made in many countries. We probably all know on Napa Cabernet Sauvignon. I mean, California is a very large part of Cabernet Sauvignon production in the world. In the US, we also have Washington State, which makes some amazing Cabernet Sauvignon, a little cooler climate compared to Napa. Then we also have Bordeaux, we have France in general, we have Italy, and then in the Southern Hemisphere, we got plenty as well. We got Argentina, we got Chile, we got South Africa, we got Australia, but also plenty other ones. So it's planted everywhere, and it is planted everywhere because it has huge appeal, and it's also easier to plant than other varietals, and it just works in many different spaces. So this stylistically, Cabernet Sauvignon is a great varietal. It's a wine that is fairly high in tannins and fairly high in acid. The acid really helps, just like with Riesling like last week, the acid really helps the wine age. So when we talk about, and I get these questions a lot, like, how long does a wine age? It depends. But in general, Cabernet Sauvignon does tend to age better than other red wine varietals because it is fairly high in acid. And it also has a lot of tannins. So those two combined make Cabernet Sauvignon a wine that usually ages fairly well. It is also a varietal that is used, where people use a lot of oak, as we can see in many wines from Napa. And, it is also used in most parts of the world. It's just the oak just helps soften the tannins, and then the wines are easier to drink, not so tannic, and ready to go a little bit earlier. The wines in general are fairly big. Like I mentioned, we have wines that have big tannins, that are fruit forward in general, depending on where you make them. And sometimes it saddens me a little bit. And I'm going into a little bit detail when people go to, let's say, like a nice restaurant, or like, let's say, a nice steakhouse, and they go there and they go like, so what should we have with our steak? And people in especially nicer restaurants don't go for the inexpensive wines that are usually like, easier and open up fairly quickly. Whereas when you go, buy the nicer wines and spend a fair amount of money, the wines are, when you open them, still fairly tannic. And even if the waiter brings out a decanter and gives the wine some opportunity to open up through the air, through the exposure to oxygen, it just doesn't happen that fast. I mean, your steak comes out in like 30, 40 minutes and you start drinking your wine, you go like, well, this is not what I expect. So what I always tell people is look at those wine lists in the morning, the night before, give the restaurant a call and see if they can open the wine for you beforehand. Pick the wine, have them open it, I don't know, lunchtime, and then come for dinner, and you'd be very, very happy compared to people who picked at night, which is what most people do. So we talked about the ageability. We talked about oak. We talked about tannins. We talked about acid. We talked about this. We haven't talked too much about the style. I mentioned that Cabernet Sauvignon in general is a wine that's fairly big, but depending on where you grow it, styles are different. Napa, you have big fruit, big powerful wines, but then if you go, for example, to Washington State or Bordeaux, or you go to Australia, for example, the wines become a little greener, and not in a negative way. It's just the style of the wine is just different because the climate is different. It doesn't mean that one wine is better than the other or one style is better than the other. It's just stylistically they are different. In France, where in Bordeaux specifically, also often Cabernet Sauvignon is maybe picked sometimes somewhat early. And then what we get in Bordeaux a lot is we don't get monovarietal wines. We get the wines blended with other varietals, and that kind of helps counter the wines being, the Cabernet Sauvignon specifically being picked maybe a little bit early. So when you look at wines from Bordeaux, you have wines that are often a blend of the Bordeaux varietals. I mean, Merlot, for example, is a pretty big part usually of Bordeaux, whereas if you go to Napa Valley, you will have a lot of 100% Cabernet Sauvignon wines. It's not apples to apples. I mean, Bordeaux is born in different parts of the world, but stylistically, they are somewhat different. So when you go out shopping, pay attention to where the wines are from. Look at the and I mentioned this last week. Look at the alcohol percentages. That gives you also a pretty good indication of the style of the wine. So if you have wines that Cabernet Sauvignon at like 13%, most likely they're not going to be quite as fruit forward and big than if you have something that, let's say, with 14.5, 15%. So when you are shopping for wines, pay attention to the alcohol levels, because for many varietals, that information is very, very telling. So that was my summary on Cabernet Sauvignon for this Friday evening. Next week, we'll be talking about more varietals. And enjoy your Friday evening with maybe some Riesling, talked about last week, or some Cabernet Sauvignon. So enjoy your evening, enjoy your weekend, and I will see you next week. Bye, everybody.